Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here tonight. There's a lot that I want to try to convey to you this evening, and I'm not sure how much of it I'll end up conveying, but I will do my best. I'm here this evening because I have a really deep desire to be a part of a community that is thinking deeply about what's going on in the world, and that's striving to work together, collaborate together, think together, and educate children together in a way that's in service of the evolution of our culture. And, my journey in doing that work has led me on a, sort of winding path. And really, there's so much for us to just unpack and think about together if we even are going to start that process, right, of trying to figure out what is going on in the world. When are we in history, and how do we understand ourselves in a historical context? Who are we, and why are we here, right? I feel like the things that are happening in the world today, I've sort of come to the conclusion that they can't be really understood well if they're not understood in a very rich and nuanced and deep context, right? It's all about the context in which we even try to understand what's going on. So, the sort of surface level topic of the talk tonight is building community, understanding polarization, understanding sort of cultural fragmentation, trying to sort of grapple with the challenges that we're facing in contemporary culture in the context of an election year in the United States and all that comes with that, and war and violence that's happening in the world, and there's just a lot. And I will try to address those issues tonight, but my underlying sense is that we have to try to look at what's underneath those things. And I'm striving, and apparently I'm publicly striving to just really try to grapple with these big questions. So that's my intention for this evening. My request to you is to just try to stay with me, to help me with your presence and your listening. And I'm assuming that if you are listening closely, questions will probably arise, because I might have to sort of, summarize or paraphrase some pretty, in some ways controversial, in some ways just complex topics. So if questions do arise, please try to hold them. I'd love to have a robust Q&A at the end, if that's possible. But do please hold them till the end. I'll try to get through what I'm sort of working through here. So, and also I just want to name, I'm sort of thinking about a series of conversations I want us to have as a school community. And this is the first one. In some ways, it's going to be, I think, some sort of the hardest and the biggest, because I want to try to plant some seeds and really get across some big ideas that will carry into further topics. We're going to be talking about social media and technology, more specifically later. So not a lot tonight. We're going to be talking specifically about artificial intelligence and the brain and teen health. So, that's to come. But so I'm sort of trying to lay a foundation this evening for, again, how do we understand those big topics? Hopefully some of the frames we get tonight will help us. So with that, I'll dive into really thinking about first this topic of polarization, right? Because that's one of the things that is sort of most front and center in our world right now. And we're trying to figure out how to situate ourselves in the conversation, if you can call it that, more like the hysteria of political campaigns and sort of partisan warfare that's happening. And I kind of want to highlight some points from a book called The Myth of Left and Right to sort of start off, just to sort of look at that frame that we've been put into of like this political spectrum. And there's so much energy right now moving us to sort of pick a side and to frame things really starkly and to really use a lot of fear, frankly, to sort of get you to identify with one side or to sort of manipulate your identity to get you to have certain feelings against other people. And I really feel like a first step is to kind of step back and sort of look at that framing of left versus right. And there's a book called The Myth of Left and Right that does a pretty good job of that. It's sort of a concise academic book, but I just want to pull some thoughts out of there. I won't really go into so much of what's causing polarization. With that, we'd really have to talk about actually social media and the sort of algorithmic manipulation of our attention. There's a lot going on with just our media ecology and the way that it's digitized and screen-based that sort of is funneling us in these oppositional directions. But I just want to look at sort of where we've landed. And one thing to point out is that, a key insight from this book that I became convinced of is that we sort of think of ourselves as having a philosophy or having an ideology, and that leads to what sort of team we're on. But there's actually a lot of research and insight into the fact that ideologies actually don't define tribes so much as tribes define ideologies, right? And we're sort of tribal group-based people at various levels of who we are. And we have such a deep need and deep longing to be a part of a tribe and a group. And political parties have become, in some ways, our primary sort of mode of finding belonging. And it's interesting, if you look historically at how the views of the parties have changed, they've really shifted a lot over time. Or if, there's so many examples in the book in terms of, a certain party or politician enacts big spending, and that's seen as being emblematic of that party. But then the other party will do the same thing, and it's emblematic of that party, right? You can also look at it demographically and look how the demographic constitution of the groups have actually flipped over time. You can really trace certain key issues and see that there's actually no coherent ideology or philosophy that actually holds up these two supposed ideological tribes. It actually really is the case that people find their identity and then they conform their thinking to what that group tells them is right and wrong. And that's how we also get the phenomena of all these clusters of ideas, right? We have lots of different positions on different issues, and we're really good at telling stories. I'll talk about that more. We're very much storytelling creatures. So we're really good at telling a narrative. It's called about sort of why we think what we think and why we believe what we believe. But so many people have views on topics that aren't actually related to each other, like your position on economics, your position on international warfare, your position on abortion, your position on the size of government, your position on education, your position on healthcare. All these things aren't necessarily philosophically related, but once you have an identity, your group tells you what to believe about all of those things. And then you can create a story to try to weave them all together. So it's just a really interesting shift of the frame to see that fundamentally we're sort of in this group, we're in this need to find our group, right? And we're getting caught in this sort of very polarized culture that is it's just not healthy. And part of the reason for this too is just that things are getting more and more complex and complicated. And we also have a deep need to simplify, right? We want someone to just tell us the answer. We want a simple solution to complicated problems. But we have to be careful of that, basically, as people. Another thing we find, actually, is a positive correlation between education and essentialism. So they find that actually the more people go through the educational system, the more they've been sort of taught about and told about these essential different philosophies, right? The left thinks this and the right thinks this. And you actually start to believe that more and more as you sort of go through our education systems, which is interesting as a sort of data point as a school, right? How do you create an educational system that's actually helping people to think as individuals and to come up with more nuanced and granular views on issues and topics that are not just identity-based and group-based? Another thing about sort of this tendency to identify with a side or an ideology, feeling like, oh, I'm progressive or I'm conservative, it actually allows us to be tribal without feeling tribal, right? So we have this deep need to have a group, but we also have a deep need to actually act like we're not doing that. So part of it is just really coming to more awareness of those tendencies in ourselves, and seeing how the language that we use kind of perpetuates that. And we have to find a way ultimately to find healthier tribes, right? We do need tribes, we need community, and that's why we're here. So just to sort of put that out there, that my hope here for us as a school community and in this area is to actually be a real community, but that has shared values that are not pulled in by or tied to or limited to the ones that are sort of dominating our culture right now. Because the truth is that reality is a lot more complicated than just picking one of two worldviews. And my sense is that we actually just need a more sophisticated and accurate understanding of why different people think the way they do and feel the way they do. So that leads me into really thinking about what in some ways, in my mind, has become the main topic for this evening, is trying to find a way to talk about structures of consciousness. And I met my wife in grad school at the University of Chicago in 2005, and we met at a philosophy of religion meeting of some group. And she asked me, who I was and what I was interested in. And I think one of the first things I said was, I'm interested in understanding structures of consciousness. And that's how she knew she found the one. I had already been really, grappling with that sort of frame and that idea for a while. So I've been trying to work through what does that mean, really, for these past 20, 25 years? Like, what does it mean for people to have different structures of consciousness, right? And how do you really understand that, grapple with that? And that can really only be understood in an evolutionary context, right? So we have to find a way, whatever's happening in the world today, whatever's happening with the way that the digital environment's affecting us, whatever's happening at the moment in terms of warfare and violence, whatever's happening right now in terms of confusion and culture war and cultural conflict, we have to find a way to understand it in the big arc of history and the evolution of consciousness and culture. So I want to try to just drop some admittedly oversimplified frames for us to work with, and then we'll kind of see maybe what questions come up and where we can get to. But part of that, too, that I want to name now, and maybe I should have said this clear at the beginning, one of the aspects of the social world that we're living in right now is a sort of loss of a coherent story that holds everything together, right? And if you think about human history, every culture has had stories that tell them who they are and why they're here. And one of the things that we can come to awareness of now is that when we see where we've landed and what constitutes our culture, we look back at the stories of the past as myths and as magical and as not true. But the story that we're left with is either not inherently valuable and meaningful and does not lend us a clear sense of what our purpose is in life, or we just don't think that there is a such thing as a true story. And it's all just made up. It's all just different people making up different stories, which we call social constructions, right? So that's one thing that I'm going to keep circling back to, because I think in some ways it might be our primary task, actually, is coming to grips with the fact that we're living in a culture that's sort of in the semi-conscious background. People are actually feeling like their life is meaningless and purposeless and pointless if it's all just matter colliding, and if there's no God to sort of take on that sort of meaning-making position in your cosmology. We actually haven't gotten to a place yet as a species where we have clear and coherent and comprehensive stories about how to make sense of that and how to make sense of our place in the world. And if you don't have a shared story as a group, it's really hard to cohere and collaborate and coordinate as a group, right? It's hard to sort of see each other as being on the same team if we don't have a shared story. So somehow we actually have to find a better story, hopefully one that's actually true, that we can authentically believe is true, that actually includes everyone, so that we can transcend the really lame and unfortunate stories that we're being left with in terms of the story of what it means to be a progressive or conservative, for instance. So when we think about the evolution of consciousness and culture, there's many different frames that we can work with. So on one hand, we can think about just the way that things seem to have unfolded, right? So we can think about what's sometimes called the 3 big bangs or the 4 big bangs, meaning matter emerging, life emerging, and then conscious beings emerging, right? There's a scholar, I think it's Merlin Donald, I could be wrong, who maybe has a book called The 3 Big Bangs. My friend David Temple recently wrote a book that's on the table over there. He talks about the 4 big bangs, basically matter, life, mind, and then humanity sort of as distinct from other animals being the 4th. So, and this notion of a big bang is like, we actually don't exactly know from our positionality right now how these things actually emerged fully, but we know that they're here and we know that there's these layers and levels of reality. Rudolf Steiner, for what it's worth, who I will be weaving in here and there throughout to sort of try to bring some of these other overarching stories into alignment and resonance, hopefully, with Steiner's story of cosmology. He talks about minerals, plants, animals, and humanity, right? And that pretty much tracks the 4 big bangs. We can think about also, just thinking about humans, we can think about going from being self-centered to group-centered to more world of humanity centered, right? There's a sort of evolution that happens there in our consciousness and our awareness and our identity. There's a one frame, a brilliant theorist named Jean Gebser talks about magic, mythic, mental, and integral, right? So these are different stages we can go through. We can go through a sort of magical consciousness, mythic consciousness, mental consciousness, and then potentially integral consciousness, right? And this sort of tracks with egocentric, group-centric, world-centric, what some people then would even say is cosmocentric at the end. So there's hundreds of developmental theorists working with models like these. They all overlap and use different language, but the basic idea is there are these huge transformations we go through of consciousness as people, individually and collectively. And it's a really, really difficult thing to talk about because the implications touch everything. But as just one quick example that came up for me this week that kind of I thought was an interesting touch point, I took a walk Monday morning with a group of first graders. And there was a little boy in the class who held my hand the whole time, almost an hour, walking through the woods. We're just, traipsing through the woods hand in hand, and boy, did I get an earful from this little 6-year-old. And it turns out that he's the king of magic. He said so himself. And, he flew to Africa once, and he landed in some sawgrass, and he cut his feet, but they didn't bleed. But actually turns out that was Florida. But they got to Florida by his family just jumped on his back, and they flew to Florida on his back because he's the king of magic, and he's just got it like that. So I was so blessed to be walking with him. And it was just so striking of like, this perfect, marvelous being is in a very different structure of consciousness than I am right now, right? That is like quintessential magic. He named it himself. And that's the magical structure of consciousness, right? He hasn't fully emerged into the mythic yet, right? The mythic is where we find actually a different order of story, a different kind of story, right? We see the emergence of the great religions with their great stories of good and bad and right and wrong and order and the sort of beliefs of civilization, right? The beliefs and the stories and the myths that hold large groups of people together with a shared identity so that they can actually have something like a civilization or an empire, something a lot larger than a tribe or a small group. So just to sort of, just try to think, try to feel history in that way and all the implications of sort of, having what was by some people called sort of original participation, like a sort of magical animistic relationship to reality, and then coming into having to find a way to coordinate really large groups of people and coming up with law and order and a sense of like, how do you actually get large groups of people to work together? Typically, the default ways are with really clear hierarchies, a lot of inequality, and really clear lines between in-groups and out-groups, right? This is sort of how these dynamics evolved. I didn't mention Steiner, and I meant to. He sort of also similarly has this sense of people moving from the sentient soul to the intellectual soul to the consciousness soul, right? And that's pointing past the mythic into more individuated individuality of individuals thinking for themselves, but seeing how individuals are all fundamentally equal and the same on some level. And we can see that rhyming with a sort of modern consciousness, or what Gebser calls the mental, right? So somehow we emerge into this more sense of ourselves as individuals. We individuate more fully. But by doing that, it's not just an egocentric move, it's actually recognizing I'm an I, you're an I. There's some sort of actual potential for recognizing the self that's the same in all of us, right? What Emerson called the oversoul, what some people call the true self. When you become an individual, you actually now have the potential to recognize your I-amness and the I-amness of other people. And from this structure of consciousness is what emerges even the possibility to have something like the idea that all people are equal, right? To even have the possibility to be able to proclaim ultimately as a value of the universe that something like slavery is wrong, right? That murder is wrong, even if they're the other, right? There's opening to the possibility of there being no other, of us actually all being the same. Prior to the mental structure, prior to the individuation which emerged in the modern world and modern consciousness, there was always really clear distinctions between in-groups and out-groups, very different treatment, right? And we are all living not just on the shoulders of giants, but on the piles of bones, right? There's been so much warfare, so much conflict, so much raping and pillaging and slavery and intergroup conflict. That is basically the status quo of not just our species, but also other animals. And the very idea that we could sort of grow beyond that and actually live in a peaceful world where even Democrats and Republicans might be able to get along, we're not there yet, you know? Like we take it for granted that we're sort of in this modern, postmodern, individuated worldview and that everything else is just wrong, right? So we look back on history and it's like we see oppression everywhere. Actually, another frame is it's not actually so much oppression, it's that even the possibility for the emergence of a world-centric equality hadn't emerged yet, right? It's a really important difference. If you look back at history and you just see everything as oppression versus you look back at history and you see, wow, like the things that we now feel are possible were not possible back then. And excuse me, I actually had notes here that I'm not following at all, so let me try to see where I am. So just the sense that, you know, for instance, like between 1770 and 1870, slavery was outlawed in all modern societies, right? In a very short span of time. Groups of people where even just a certain percentage of people became, it becomes common sense and obvious. Like just for like my 6-year-old friend, like being in that magical world is just, it's obvious, it's just how he's living. For me, it was really obvious, not to like give it away, it was really obvious he didn't fly his family to Florida on his back, right? That's just, I don't have to explain that. It's obvious to everyone in the room because we're living more in a mental structure of consciousness and less in a magical structure of consciousness, right? And it's similar for something like the basic moral truths that we take to be so obvious. We project them onto others as though everyone else should just see it that way, but they don't. And we have to learn how to see life from the inside, right? Like not just looking and listening with our eyes and our ears, but actually feeling what different structures feel like and what it's like to inhabit them. Because another sort of fundamental principle that you come across in studying developmental psychology and these structures is there is some sort of interesting holonic relationship where they build on each other and they transcend and include each other, right? But that is an important notion of what constitutes health, both psychological health, emotional health, and on a different frame, physical health, the degree to which you are well integrated, right? The degree to which the different layers and levels of yourself, the different structures of what you are and who you are working together, right? So as you grow up into the mental, you don't want to totally lose touch with the magical part of you. It's sad, but it happens to most adults when they grow up. They lose the magic. I'm fortunate in that I spent many of my adult years with young children, and I feel like in some ways it was like an intuition that I didn't want to totally lose touch with that, you know? And you also don't want to lose touch with the foundational, civilizational, mythic sort of architecture of what holds groups of people together. So these are sort of building blocks, and one of the patterns that you see throughout history is that when a new structure emerges and starts to become commonplace, it partly does so through differentiation from and critique of the previous structure in people who are still inhabiting those structures, right? So, for instance, the mythic ethos, the mythic worldview, the mythic stories, they were very much against the sort of pagan, pre-religious sort of lifestyle and worldview, right? Similarly, if you think about what modernity is, if you think about the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, what you're seeing is a deep critique of and differentiation from the mythic worldview, the mythic structure. And that's important. You know, it's also important for us now, being so far removed from that. We're in a place where our culture is mostly, maybe not mostly, our culture is very much consumed by critiquing modernity and the modern world, right? We are criticizing and differentiating ourselves from not only the sort of mental, sort of modern associated structures of being and thinking, but also anything associated with them, right? So we're making associations between types of people and ways of thinking and being hypercritical of them. But part of the irony there is that we have to do that, I think, to some extent. It's sort of inevitable and important. But we also want to try to find a way to integrate and include the good and healthy and necessary and important things of all of those previous structures. We have to appreciate both the dignities and the disasters of the modern world and of the past and of history, but also of just different ways of thinking and being in the world. And it's important to see, you know, people like Voltaire and Montesquieu and Kant, like what they were doing was really criticizing colonialism and Eurocentrism, like really harshly. That's basically what they were doing. And most of their books were burned or banned or published posthumously because they were so critical of the current status quo of their society. And many of the sort of leading thinkers at that time were already super critical of the things that now our college-age students and young people are critical of. Like, they were critical of those things 200 years ago. But we've sort of lost that because we actually don't read them that carefully or closely. And I'm just saying that just to sort of name that we have to try to appreciate what they were working through and what they were coming out of. And also to appreciate that, you know, the modern world also that got created really depended on the structures and the values that were put in place in the pre-modern world. So in the pre-modern world and the development of religious cultures, people became enveloped in social worlds that were steeped in beliefs and values about goodness, about what's true, about what's meaningful, about the purpose of their life, right? That we're talking about centuries, if not millennia, where people were just sort of steeping in these stories and these things that they took to be very, very true, that gave meaning to human life. And what has happened over the past few hundred years, you know, as we criticize and differentiate from those stories, we're starting to realize the degree to which we depended on them, and we haven't found great replacements for them. So there's been a lot of, I think, confusion around that point, because as we've differentiated from the emergence of the mental and the modern, and we're moving into now what some people call the postmodern, or some people just call sort of a deficient mode of the mental. That's how Gebser calls it. We're sort of still in the mental structure, but it's becoming more and more deficient and starting to break down, almost like eat itself, critique itself, as a process of waiting for the next structure to emerge, right? Which Gebser calls the integral, and which sort of symbolizes the ability to actually not just sort of keep going in a linear way, but actually the possibility that human beings might find a way, as we become more conscious, to sort of recognize and appreciate these different ways of being in the world and bring them together in our own experience, so that we're living in a magical and mythical and mental world simultaneously in a way that actually allows us to re-inhabit the fact that we're living in a world that is inherently valuable and meaningful and beautiful. And it seems we haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. But my sense is we're figuring it out and that it's possible. Another thing I just want to highlight, I kind of said it, but I want to slow down and unpack it a little bit more. One of the ways of understanding the sort of culture that emerged around the mental structure and the potential sort of degradation of the mental structure over the past couple hundred years is, the mental structure is what we could see clearly enabled the evolution of science, right? And we see huge advances in technology and science over the past few hundred years. There's no way to doubt that or question that. But through sociobiology, evolutionary biology, psychology, we've sort of been pulled into a materialistic understanding of what's real. And to sort of dovetail back to Steiner, this is really relevant for education and for Waldorf education, because actually the foundation of Waldorf education comes from an awareness of the fact that people are living in this mental modern world, and we're getting pulled into a kind of worldview that ultimately will lead to a kind of cynicism and nihilism, because we've sort of lost connection with our sort of more magical, mythical connection to the inner world, and we're caught up in sort of the, I think because we've differentiated ourselves from that and critiqued that, we've sort of told ourselves a new story that's just it's more materialistic, it's more on the surface, it's more empirical, because that was the avenue through which we were able to actually make that ultimate distinction between like scientific feedback of what's real and what's not versus someone just having a story that doesn't stand the test of time. So we've kind of thrown out the baby with the bathwater in that sense, but as a result, people feel like they're living in a world where there's no inherent value. And that's kind of the ultimate sort of, it's the ultimate sort of realization at the bottom of that worldview, is that it seems like the world's meaningless. But the thing is, it's not. It's not. I'll give you the punchline now. The world is not meaningless and valueless. There's something that we've gone through as a species where we've disconnected ourselves from our source and our origin and our connection to the reality itself. Like, we are an expression of reality. We're directly connected to reality. We can actually experience it in ourselves subjectively, the reality and the truth of it. And we have to cultivate the ability to know that directly and inherently and clearly, and to trust our own experience with that, and to not be caught up in the abstractions and the projections and the rationalizations of the mental, right? We've developed this capacity to abstract. We've developed this capacity to sort of distance ourselves from the world, but we've lost that sense of original participation with the world. But the whole gist of the story here is that that's still real. Like, it's still real that you actually are connected to origin and source, and that there are actually new stories we can tell that weave all these threads together. I have a couple quotes here that maybe will help. Somebody else's words might be better than mine. So this is it's actually something I just came across recently. It's Cynthia Bourgeault actually describing the work of Jean Gebser, who's talking about structures and trying to describe, here's thinking about the perspectival world, what he calls the perspectival world, which is like the mental modern world, as distinct from what Owen Barfield called original participation, right? So we're making this distinction between like being tuned in sort of inherently connected to the valuable, beautiful, sacred world, and sort of creating a differentiation from that through developing a sort of individuated mental structure. As we enter the perspectival world, the double-edged sword begins to fall. The same growing capacity for abstraction that makes possible the perception of proportion and depth also by the same measure increases our sense of separation. Order is maintained, but at the cost of a necessary distancing, as original participation gives way to a growing sense of dislocation and exile. On the upside, tremendous powers of abstraction, synthesis, and mastery. On the downside, objectification, alienation from the whole, and that chronic background anxiety caused by having removed oneself from the world in order to perceive it. So that's the shift that we and our ancestors have lived through and been living through. But it's not the end of the story. There's good news. There's good news. Don't worry. I feel like I'm bringing the room down a little bit. But it's a beautiful story, I think. But one thing we have to look at now, so to kind of, there's this overarching history. There's thinking about these different structures. And again, like there's many different words and labels we can use. You can break this process up into 3 structures or 5 structures or 7 structures. You know, you can't confuse the map and the territory, right? Like we're all sort of groping our way through the territory of consciousness and culture and trying to create maps to make sense of it. But none of these words and none of these maps actually are the territory itself. We have to live that for ourselves. But the thing we need to sort of now focus in on is looking through maybe these prisms and these lenses to understand really the real problems that we're facing right now. Like in this sort of deficient mental mode, in this postmodern mode where we're obsessed with criticizing the modern world, but we don't really know what the new story is yet. How is that tearing us apart? How is that affecting us? How is that related to polarization, to retribalization, right? And, you know, the gist of this part of the story is that actually there is a beautiful thing about this waking up that we're doing to recognize that there's pluralism, right? So one way of thinking about this is pluralism, in that there's many different stories. We're starting to realize, like, whoa, history is filled with all different kinds of people, with all different kinds of beliefs, and there's something in us now that we're individuated that wants to recognize that they're all equal, right? Everyone's equal. We all sort of have this I-ness. You're the same as me. Your story is just as good as mine. That's a beautiful, very evolved, like, perception. But it leads actually to a form of relativism, where just, well, who's to say? Whose story is better or worse? But that collapses into nihilism, right? If everyone's story is the same, then nothing's better or worse, so it all becomes kind of meaningless, right? This is the milieu that we're living in right now. And yeah, another quote here that might help us out. One of the books that we read as a staff is called Developmental Politics. It wasn't a fan favorite, but it's got some great and really important ideas in it, and I do give it my highest recommendation. And one of the quotes here is that without the liberal protections of individual freedom provided by modernist values and the foundational norms of fair play and honesty provided by traditional values, postmodern culture would soon regress to a pre-traditional level of warring factions. I think that's kind of what we're seeing right now, is we've sort of lost the importance of holding on to the liberal protections of freedom provided by modernity and sort of modernist universal truths, and we've lost some of the bedrock foundational civilizational building ideas and stories of traditional values, and therefore we've almost sort of regressed into like these warring factions who don't, it's like we've lost the coherence that is offered by some of those traditional values and modern values. And the book Developmental Politics does a good job of actually, maybe it's simpler than some of the ways that I'm framing, because really focusing in on traditional values, modern values, and postmodern values, and how these values are still living in people now, right? And that's sort of one of the big ideas, is to see that these structures are in us. They're all in us, and we're all sort of resonating with and identifying with different aspects of them at different times without full awareness of what we're doing or why. But it's kind of the lens that we're looking through. As we learn to look at these lenses, we enact our own development, right? So we're all sort of tuning into traditional values or modern values or postmodern values, which do have some complex, and I won't be able to fully explain, relationship to the evolution of these structures. But we're all sort of looking through a lens, and the move that we are, I think, going to have to learn how to make, which is why I'm actually up here talking right now, is because the direction we're going is to learn how to look at and understand these different worldviews, to empathize with them, right? To have compassion for them, to see how they show up in our own selves and in our own minds and in our own thinking. But what has happened in our so far inability to do that successfully on a wide scale, we've landed in a place where we feel like there's no universal truths. And the idea that there are no universal truths leads to many of the things that we're seeing in our culture that are the most problematic, I think can be explained by keeping in mind, like, oh yeah, people are acting like there's no universal truths. That's why they're doing things like using strategic essentialism, right? Which means, well, no story is really, really real, so I'm going to strategically use a story to sort of benefit my group of the moment, right? So we're finding neo-tribes or groups we identify with. We're sort of hunkering down and contracting and collapsing on the identity of ourselves in that group because we don't know what else to do. It's sort of built in to who we are as beings. And we find ourselves in this place where there is no coherent story that connects us to everyone else. So you strategically manipulate language, you strategically manipulate concepts and ideas for the benefit of your group politically. That's pretty much what we're seeing as the regressive move that the political sphere is taking, and also that the sort of social media ecosystem is taking. And there's lots of contradictions in that way of thinking, and I could talk more about that, but I think I'll skip over it. But the thing to highlight is that we sort of, we're falling into that, and it's something that actually, it's sort of ironic that it's something that actually can bring us all together, is to see that we're all falling into that, right? It's not just the other side that's falling into that. We're all falling into these big traps of playing into this sort of default narrative that there's no universal story that connects us all, and therefore justifying taking on the story of our group or our tribe and using our thinking in strategic and manipulative ways in order to win some sort of power struggle with the other group, right? We sort of devolve to this level of power. And actually, if you dig into sort of postmodern theory, it's kind of what it comes down to, is there's power and there's language and there's the social constructions of different groups, right? So every group's going to come up with different constructions of what they think is real. The use of language is super important because language is actually what we use to constitute those constructions and to have power over other people. And that sort of lens, that mental lens, looking back at history and the present, what it does is it kind of reduces everything to that. It's sort of a way of looking. You can look at anything that's happening in the world and sort of say, oh, look at those people who are strategically using their language games to construct stories for the benefit of themselves and their group. Like, you can do that. You can take that as a lens and explain the world that way. And that's what lots of people are actually being taught to do. We call that education. We call that sophisticated theory, right? But it's dysfunctional. It's dysfunctional because it doesn't see itself as a lens. It actually ironically sees itself as making an objective universal truth statement about reality. And that's one of the contradictions that we can see to sort of wake us up out of this spell, is that the story that everything is a social construction and that there's no universal truth is a universal truth claim, that you're claiming to be real about reality for everyone. So there's got to be some breakdown there, right? It's almost like we've found, if we could just admit it, if we could just get more really sophisticated theorists who've been overeducated to admit it, you can't actually escape the attempt to make universal truth claims. You can't live your life that way. You know, another good test for whether a philosophy makes sense or not is it one that you can actually raise children through coherently, right? Like, can you actually raise children telling them that everything's just a social construction and nothing's really real or true and it's all just bullshit, but we're going to pretend like it's true so that we can get our power because we deserve it because we've been victimized due to X, Y, Z, right? You can't raise children well in that context. And that's kind of why I wanted to sort of start with this big picture story right now, because we're going to see that coming up in later conversations as we talk about social media, as we talk about teen mental health, as we talk about the impact of AI, as we talk about the brain and how it filters reality. Like, we have to be able to see that we have to create a story that makes sense for our children so that they feel like they know that they're coming into a world that makes sense, where they have meaning and purpose and value. And again, they do. We can tell a coherent story where that is true. And we can't let contemporary cultural regression convince us otherwise. Another quick quote. This is from Ken Wilber, sort of on this idea of truth and like the loss of truth. He's saying, it has indeed become the defining issue of our century, because not a single other issue can be directly and effectively addressed if there is no compass point of accessible truth to guide action in the first place. Right? And the way that Wilber kind of frames this story is that, you know, once we really understand the contradictions and the dysfunctions of what's sort of like the leading edge of culture right now, like this really hyper-mental, hyper-abstract, really sophisticated using big words and language to sort of talk circles around issues, you know, the kind of language games that our college graduates end up playing in their 20s. This sort of worldview, it's not like, it's not actually something you can ground a healthy and coherent culture that's going to raise healthy and coherent children. Right? So we have to be able to see that, and we have to get to the other side of it. Okay, another quote, because I think hopefully that will be helpful. This is another one from Cynthia Bourgeault, talking about this transition that we can potentially move through now, I think. The turbulent social upheavals that erupted full force in the early 20th century and have continued more or less unbroken right into our own times can be attributed in large part to the phase of the cycle now playing out, the mental structure of consciousness in its deficient mode. The good news is that this turmoil is in fact a birth canal, and the contractions we are collectively anguishing through are indeed the birth pangs of the rising aperspectival structure making its presence powerfully known. The bad news is that labor is bloody hell. I think that's true. I feel like that's actually part of my story, is that we're going through a bloody hell of a time right now, but evolution doesn't stop, right? We're in motion. We're in process. It's another sort of, I think, fallacy of presentism of our thinking, to act like the way the world is now is somehow the end of this story that we can see looking back. But everything, as Dante said, everything is in medias res, right? We're in the middle of the story. So another quote, another book that we read as a staff, and I'll try to wrap this up in terms of really pointing our way forward here. One of the books that we read is called Compassionate Conversations. And it's a delightful book because it actually draws on this evolutionary frame, but it does so in a very subtle way, focusing on how we show up for each other compassionately in our diversity. But one of the key ideas there is they say, we seek to evolve conversation so that we can move fluidly between our ego identification, our ethnocentric loyalties, our group-centered loyalties, our world-centric cares, and the freedom and calm that a cosmocentric perspective brings us, right? So that's the language they use, is egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, cosmocentric. But it's the same structures that we're trying to move through. And to also bring it home in terms of collectively, you know, one of the things that we have to do collectively is to rediscover some sense of transcendent meaning for us as a country, even just thinking about this country and sort of bring it back to the polarization, the political ads that I'm forced to look at every time I watch a show nowadays. It's another thing McIntosh says in Developmental Politics. In the same way that our personal fulfillment is ultimately connected to our own self-transcendence, our society's collective fulfillment similarly depends on its connection with an authentically transcendent purpose for humanity as a whole. So that's kind of the gist of it. And another point to highlight is sort of for those of us, which is most of us, I think, in our social worlds, who are inhabiting to some degree this sort of pluralistic, critical of the modern, very mental, sort of very abstract social cultural world that we're in. In one sense, we sort of have two choices. And in terms of our relationship to the other structures, right? So we're in relationship with, like, if we have sort of, say for instance, progressive postmodern values, and we sort of associate with that world of like critical of modern values, critical of the modern world, critical also of traditional religion and pre-modern religion, like just critical, that's all oppression, right? That's all where oppression happens. And it's only us enlightened progressive people who actually see that like slavery is bad and racism is bad and gender inequality is bad, right? If that's the world that you're living in terms of how are you going to relate to the other values and the other structures, we either have to sort of double down and continue to fight against them and demonize them, or we have to find a way to embrace them and empathize with them and integrate them, right? And that's sort of like the move that you have to make when you get to that point in yourself and in your culture is you have to at some point wake up to the fact that fighting against, pushing against, demonizing, belittling other ways of experiencing the world, other value structures, is counterproductive. It does not help, it does not heal, and it actually harms you as well, because it's actually you hitting a roadblock in your own growth and development. Whereas if you can shift your relationship to people who are experiencing the world in a different way, if you can see that that actually is a part of your own being, and that you actually do share that sense of I with them, you actually do share an oversoul with them, you do share a true self with everyone, that's the road that you have to take if you want to kind of keep going on this beautiful story. And we have to create cultures where that's the norm, that's the expectation, that's the directionality, that's the implicit and now I guess explicit messaging in terms of like, what are we doing, why are we here, and where are we going? So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you for listening. And perhaps there are questions in the crowd. It's a lot. It's a lot, and I'm hoping that that's just okay.
Brad, can you explain what you mean by modern world?
Yes.
What does that mean to you? Can you rephrase it?
Yeah, so what do I mean by the modern world? So I used a lot of different words and language sort of in overlapping ways. And it could be teased apart a lot. And if you look at different people who try to answer that question, who are like super legit and thoughtful and I think have a lot to offer, they'll answer it in slightly different ways. So I'd make a couple distinctions. One is there's at least two things we want to distinguish, which I've sort of been conflating and overlapping kind of sloppily, is looking back at history, right? Like what happened historically, where do we demarcate different periods of time, and what's the relationship between those demarcations and different demographics, different groups of people, right? Are we just tracking the sort of evolution of the West? Are we coming up with a story or a framework that actually includes all people somehow? Are we sort of overly reifying or like holding on to a story too tightly in terms of sharp differences, right? Those are all problems in this conversation because the territory is fluid, right? There's no clear lines like there are on a map. So different ages flow into other ages. You can see the mental structure of consciousness showing up in individuals in pre-modern times, in the deep, deep past, right? So you always have this process of individuals manifesting the emergence of new and emergent and different structures than those that are common. But one of the ways to think about the emergence of time periods is this sort of nebulous sense of like a collective energy or movement or emergence of a collective inhabitants of a new structure, right? So there's an association between the modern world and the mental structure or the world-centric structure. And I think that's because there's a lot of really interesting and meaningful and valid correlations to be made between when an individual or a group is inhabiting the mental world-centric structure. Many things are going to come online in terms of how you think, how you write and speak, and the kind of actions you take and behaviors you take in terms of approaching the world more scientifically, making things like the abolition of slavery happen. So we associate, like the Renaissance, the beginning, the Enlightenment, a sort of real flowering of the sort of modern world and of mental consciousness. So, time periods wise, you're talking, I think there's sort of a common sense of like, you have your sort of ancient societies, you have medieval period, and then you have sort of modernity, 13, 14, 1500s, the emergence. But it's all, it's all fluid and nebulous. But you can definitely take a step back and see these patterns, and they're important to see and work with, but without sort of being. And you can also see the emergence of the mental and different forms of modernity in different cultures and different times, and the sort of globalization of the modern world. Sorry, but another part of it, just a huge part of it, which I won't spend a lot of time unpacking, is the relationship between the evolution of technology and the evolution of consciousness. So you can also make an association between pre-agrarian cultures with a sort of pre-mythic or magic structure. You can make a loose association between the emergence of farming and agrarian life with the development of big empires and civilizations and the myths and the mythic structure that goes along with that. You can make a meaningful association between the Industrial Revolution and the sort of, chicken and egg, mutually interpenetrating, interinfluencing between consciousness and technology, right? Consciousness creates technology, technology influences consciousness. So the Industrial Revolution is associated with modernity and the mental structure and world-centric consciousness. And now it's the closer you get to the present, the harder it is to actually see the pattern clearly because you're too close to it. Just like it's really hard to see what you're living in the present. It's, even recent history, I think it's harder to see where those lines are because there's so much overlap and there's so many contradictions. There's so many academics out in the world who can just cherry pick historical examples and pick apart everything I'm saying because, but what about this person then? And, it's hard to talk about these things because especially the sort of deficient mental postmodern consciousness is very good and focused on criticizing and deconstructing arguments like the one I'm trying to make. That's sort of their MO. But to answer just to kind of continue on the thought, the other thing I'll just add is now what's interesting to think about is for some people we're still in the modern world. And for others, they make a clearer break of the postmodern and associate that with the digital revolution. So you could associate industrial revolution and modern mental, and you can associate sort of the digital world with the postmodern. But other people like Gebser, there really is no postmodern. It's just sort of like we're experiencing the degeneration of the mental and the modern. It's sort of like the modern is deconstructing to give birth to whatever's next. And there's also, you could also trace that economically, like different forms of money and economic systems that show up in relationship with different structures. Any follow-up question there? Did that make sense?
No, that's helpful.
Ish? Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Your understanding of the change between modernity and post-modernity happened with sort of the kind of demarcation of progress ending with the First World War. Does that marry up to how you see things as well, or where we start to move into a system where, 250 years of progress with the Enlightenment project and scientific revolution, just sort of falls off the edge.
Mm-hmm.
What happens in the First World War, and then we get the responses,
Yeah.
and all sorts of other sort of art movements which really just deconstruct everything.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're seeing a lot of good touch points that are symbolic and representative of these shifts. I'd say one of the things that makes the demarcation of time so hard is that, sort of as I pointed out, even some of the Enlightenment thinkers, they were already critical of colonialism and the modern world, and they actually weren't sort of pro-progress people. They actually were hypercritical of naive ideas of progress. So there were seeds, there were like genius-planted seeds of postmodern critique back in the 1700s. And then by the time you get to the 1900s and things really starting to hit the fan, you get more of this sense of like the sort of ennui and like the nihilism and the cynicism sort of going through more and more people, of like the industrial modern world just kind of not really working, and all the hopes, sort of what you're pointing to, the hopes for progress and the really naive linear stories of both capitalism and communism sort of falling apart. That's another like clear sort of symbol of that sort of like naive modern mental story or idea kind of starting to break down. And then another clear demarcation that we can point to is people often point to like the 60s and like the hippies and the free love movement, and that sort of like, F the man, and like not buying in to the status quo of conventional modern life and culture anymore. That's another sort of big cultural flowering that's associated with postmodernity. And I think the sort of late modern, postmodern, hypercritical, sort of relativist nihilist culture that we're living in now, I think you really see it starting from like the 60s and 70s in the West and really globally. And again, it's more, I think you could make a good argument for you see these things showing up based largely on economics and access to certain technology and education as opposed to cultures or geography. So does that make sense? You see seeds planted a long time ago. You see some big world events influencing this, but then you also see real cultural shifts happening in more recent history. But all the time, there's, which also is important to recognize that, because you can see like, there were definitely clear, like individuated, hyper-rational people living 2,000-3,000 years ago, right? We still have some of their writings. And a few hundred years ago, there were already like hypercritical, more like late modern, postmodern thinkers. And also, across all those periods of time, there were people who were showing up through even other structures, more like postmodern, postmodern, integral. And here's where it's a whole different conversation that I probably shouldn't have opened up, because then you start to have to disambiguate and untangle the differences between like structures and states, and like the ability for people to wake up to the suchness of reality, regardless of what structure they interpret that through. The difference between that and just the emergence of like the next structure.
Thank you so much, Brad. It is a lot to take in, but it also is so helpful to travel through this train of thought together. I wanted to ask you about this one piece you brought up about us creating the new story. And it's a kind of a simple question, but do you think the word creating is the right word to use? And I wonder that because maybe a more nihilistic way to think about it is we're trying to create something, but if we're believing in a sense of truth, something that is and always was and always will, could it be more like we are discovering the story.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I love that question. I'm inclined to go in the direction that you're pointing on that one. Yeah, I think it would be better to not give the impression that we're talking about just creating something or making something up. I think it's of the utmost fundamental importance that we recognize that we're living in a meaningful and valuable cosmos and world, and that we have the ability to realize that, recognize that, discover that in different ways. There's also the creative element is in our creative participation with that reality, though, because there is also something imaginative and creative about the human experience of reality through the prism of different states and structures. And there are stories that have not yet been told that are going to be true. And there's something creative in that human spirit that will enact that. But yes, clearly distinguish it from a mere, construction or something that's just a story. And I'd like to mention, a book came out last year called First Principles and First Values. It's co-written by some friends of mine. And it really tries to get to the heart of that question and how do we re-understand and re-inhabit and reanimate the world as inherently meaningful and valuable. And how do we know that? How can we know that? How can we claim that and make that claim? And I think they're doing some really important work on that front.
It's like a creative discovery.
Creative discovery, yeah. We're in, again, some people referred to older structures as like original participation or something. It's there's something participatory. We are expressions of reality. We are reality, literally knowing itself. So we can play with that. There's something magical about that we are reality discovering itself and knowing itself. So anything we create is reality creating itself too, but then you need to get into more and less true stories. That has to be a part of any coherent story. Some things have to be more true than others, and that's the hard part. Mm-hmm.
So this is a question I always ask myself at this point. We're talking about sort of birth and death of rebirth. Do you just sit back and let what's supposed to sort of just happen, like once the death or the analogy of eating itself up, and just sort of let it go and let it happen because what's going to happen is just going to be born, or do we intervene with what?
Yeah. You've given birth to a couple kids, right? I don't know, it strikes me as a potential metaphor because it's happening to you, right? Once the seed is planted, there's a process that's unfolding. And you kind of just let it happen, but you're also sort of participating with that, and there's various conscious decisions that you can make that are going to have a huge impact on that process. So birth might be a good metaphor there. I don't think it's, there's always going to be judgment in terms of what actions you take with your own birth. What do you choose to eat? How do you choose to treat yourself? Do you choose to abort it or not? So I think it's a decent metaphor in the sense of like there's clearly it's a tough one when it comes down to the concrete and nuanced decisions that we have to make on a more micro scale. And I experience life in this way largely, like a lot of the little things that I do, I'm experiencing in this bigger context in a somewhat conscious way. So many little things that I do have meaning for me on their relationship to what I am experiencing as this larger unfolding happening that I'm participating in. So in that sense, it gives more meaning to every single thing that I do. And a deep sort of spiritual truth, I think, is that everything matters. And again, not even to interpret that overly materialistically or behavioristically, but potentially every thought and feeling matters and has an impact on the whole. So the absolutely unfathomable infinite context that we're all participating in and influencing, I think is such that that's a really important question for the implications that it holds for all the little decisions that you make every day. So we can't just be passive. Yeah. And I wouldn't advocate for the what could be seen as the cynical move of like throwing your hands up. But at the same time, there can be wisdom in that to the extent that you're actually relaxing and releasing into surrender of actually maybe some things that need to happen. So you can look at it either, it's all about how you're holding it. I think there's wisdom in surrender sometimes and not fighting. Like, it's definitely the case, and maybe this is more what you were pointing to, like there's so much resistance and fighting and wanting things to be a certain way, and we want reality to conform to the narrative that we have and our group has. But we're not really seeing how in the bigger story, or that there is a bigger story in which maybe that resistance is futile or misguided. So it's both and or either or both and, something like that. Yeah.
What you said about having children, I think that's a really great metaphor. Like, you give birth
The metaphor of
you let it happen.
actual physical birth, yeah.
Well, just, we have
Yeah.
children, we're actively, having children,
Mm-hmm.
and then we let it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
we try too hard to construct it, like you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
this fighting. It's really
Yeah. And then parenting is just a continuation of that metaphor. Like, your kids are going to grow up, but you do have a huge influence. Sometimes you have to surrender to the stage that they're going through and some of its dynamics, but you don't just give up. You don't ever totally not stop caring, So it's just that's a very rich sort of tension we have to live with, I think. Any other thoughts or questions? I do hope, please.
I really I resonated with so much of what you said. I find myself leaning into the nihilistic, aware of the materialistic, fighting against it. And then the whole stories. I find that so beautiful, your journey on this talk with that. I really struggle with, and what would you speak to maybe this chosen country I'm in right now, this one? I find myself struggling with cultural stories because in the making of this country, the freedom, I guess, what was the gain? All this freedom, unlimited possibility, and what was the loss? I feel like everything else.
Yeah.
When I think about if you're in a pub in Ireland,
Mm-hmm.
no one's on a phone, and people will sing a song together for 5 minutes. That's thousands of years old.
Yeah.
Here, I have to connect with men. It's alcohol and
Mm-hmm.
a team I've never
Mm-hmm.
heard of, or
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
What have we lost?
I don't know.
And how do we reclaim that or
In the framing of
heal
the
that?
community.
Yeah. Yeah. We've lost a lot, and that's part of what I hope. The danger in a lot of what I'm saying is, again, sort of the sort of mental mode is to kind of take what I'm saying, line it up in a linear narrative, say that later's better, and it's just well, it's all good, and you have sort of a naive progress narrative, right? And that's not what I'm trying to say, because I feel like what you're pointing to is sort of holding both sides and seeing like the simple good things of life that maybe have been lost, and like how to acknowledge that. And for me, I feel like it's one of the gifts of the sort of postmodern pluralistic culture and consciousness is there is this deep desire to heal and to sort of reckon with the past. And that's manifesting in a lot of confused ways, but the impulse is really good. And it is sort of at the bottom of what I was trying to sort of emphasize is this need for reintegration and wholeness, which is also another way of saying healing, right? And like the from the simplicity of, you know, sitting in a pub with friends and having that sort of wholesomeness, to like where I thought you were initially going was like thinking about this country and the dignities and disasters of all that happened here, which include genocide and slavery and all kinds of terrible things. Like, we're not quite able to just reckon with the fullness of that, I think. But my sense is that it's possible to include everything in a story that actually makes sense and is meaningful. That's not like a naive story of progress. And it's really hard to feel that fully and unpack it in language, because you'd have to be like laughing and crying and philosophizing all at the same time. Yeah. Does that get at all what you were pointing to? I feel like I took it in a different direction, but
I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I appreciate you and what you said about standing on the shoulders of giants, but also on the bones. I think about
Yeah.
built on the backs of blacks, the blood of
Mm-hmm.
Native Americans, the bones of the Chinese. I certainly consider that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a genuine and very real question of what do we have to do what do we have to do to heal that and to make peace with that? A lot of these things are open questions, but once we start to even ask those questions in a bigger context, more is possible, more healing is possible, I think. Anything else?
This might be too big of a question for the time.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could just say to be continued or something. But it seems like it's a real question for me. How much of this story is individual, and how much of it is societal and larger, and how much you can even affect a larger, you can affect your own story and your own life and the people that are around you, but can you affect, and is it even worth, and how would you do that? How would you even affect a larger story, and is that even possible?
Yeah. So the question is relationship between the individual and the collective in your own story and the bigger story, and how do you impact it if you can. I mean, I think there's one response I would have to that would rhyme with what I said to Vita in regards to like taking on the perspective that everything matters and you can't ever quantify or know the outcomes. And part of one, I think, thing to unpack in that, related to what you're saying, is recognizing the mental fallacies and predispositions and traps that we can fall into in our thinking about questions like that. For instance, identifying the tendency to like, it's sort of it's a not fully baked stage in the process to think that you as an individual can come up with some rational like plan to like change the world, right? Like that's sort of like a modern mental thing to try to do. That's sort of like, look at communism, look at some of the big stories of like, we're gonna change the world. Like the revolutionary impulse is that sort of mental modern person or people thinking that they can mentally come up with some like story or plan that's just going to change everything. And it's always naive because it's always not fully in tune with the reality of the whole and the way that everyone else and everything else is also co-influencing that story. So there's like delusions of grandeur that we can get into as individuals that are dangerous, right? So that's maybe first thing is like, don't fall into a delusion of grandeur where you think that your job is to come up with the answer and then change the world, because that's always a recipe for disaster, basically. So then what? Then what do we do? I think we recalibrate, we resensitize, we live with the question with the people who can even understand it in conversation with us, right? And we sort of, as we reintegrate the magic and the mythic, we can also reanimate post-rational, potentially trans-rational ways of understanding causality and the way that magic actually happens and things work. And you can start to reanimate an experiential, reanimate the experience of knowing reality from the inside and seeing and feeling how things can be influenced in what would appear to the sort of modern mental perspective as counterintuitive. So there's, I feel like you sort of live with the question in a way that cultivates your own interior development and your own interior relationship to reality and how reality works, including how causality works. And from there, you can kind of potentially end up in a place where you experience the idea that everything matters as not just an idea. And if you're actually living in that with people, the questions fall away because you experience it directly as the good and true and beautiful thing that you're supposed to be doing, so you just do it. Sharon?
I just want to add to it that it seems to me that you've circled back to the title of what you call this talk, because when you're living that reality in the details of life as best you can, with other people who actually recognize the same reality, at least as ideals in their story, that has a much bigger effect than just doing it as an individual. And I feel like that's kind of what you, I think, hoped for this evening, that you would begin to build a common understanding of that we need values and that we can recognize them in ourselves and together. And that is something you can do with children.
Yes.
So it just seems to me that it's coming back.
Yes. This is it. I mean, I'm trying to live the answer to that question by working at a school and having conversations like this. Because what else can you do? It feels good and true and beautiful to me to try to talk about these things with people and create that shared sense of understanding to perpetuate the evolution that's possible.
I will say that's a very important message to send to teenagers and young people in their 20s, because I think they're met with a lot of hopelessness.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what's that really doing?
Yeah.
Actually demonstrate through the love of what you're doing
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
actually it's not hopeless at all.
Totally.
I think it's just as it's a mistake to think that you can fix the world and be its savior, it's also a mistake to think that your individual thoughts and actions don't help shape the world. So
Exactly.
you have to be in between.
Yeah. In between and in relationship. See, that's the thing. The thing that's lost in the naive one is we prioritize our idea and our revolutionary aim. That's so important that the ends justify the means. And in that justification, we justify suffering, harm, and not carefully attending to the relationships that we're enmeshed in. Whereas in the second way of recognizing the truth of what you're saying, you do it sort of just with more sensitivity and humility, and knowing that like the end and the means have to be tightly coupled and in loving relationship with each other in order for it to actually go the way you want it to go and for you to be who you want to be. Yeah. And we so need that message for our young people. Which is why, again, part of my intention is as many adults as possible in a community that are even coming into this story, the more it's going to help our children. Thank you all. I had 2 other quotes I wanted to read. Should I read them or no? We need to end. I did want to say, I'll just wrap then. I have 3 other talks coming up. What I talked about tonight will be woven in kind of throughout in the future, because I'm going to be trying to talk about those things in this light. So I don't exactly know how I'll do that yet. But the other talks will be much more focused and less sort of big. They'll be more focused. We're going to talk about mental health, the brain, and AI. So thank you all. I really appreciate you coming tonight. Thank you for being a part of this community. Yeah. And I could go for another half an hour if anybody wants to keep talking.